Today is the 13th of June, 2017, and this is Athens Speakout number 406. Dave DeWitt and I will be talking about this controversial subject called the foreign policy problems. And the foreign policy of the United States is exceedingly complex. And this is the second time, or maybe third time, we're talking about Trump's foreign policy. But Trump's foreign policy leads to a tremendous historical problem of talking about American foreign policy before Trump was ever elected. And he's coming to power with a weak foreign policy. Anyway, 2 weeks ago, we started off with the pressure, mostly from the Democrats, demanding that a special prosecutor be set up that would get to the bottom of why and when Donald Trump fired the FBI Director James Comey. The Democrats hoped that this might lead to the impeachment of Donald Trump, following the pattern of Richard Nixon's impeachment from 1972 to 73 after many long investigations. So my first question to Dave DeWitt is, do you have any new information on the progress of the investigation of James Comey?
Well, since I'm sitting here with you, retired professor emeritus of history at Ohio University, I have to bring up, did you watch the James Comey testimony? Did you get to catch that?
I saw the major thrust of it, but there's so much detail.
There was all sorts
and my mind is so slow, I don't know whether he's, well, of course the Republicans are saying he's winning.
Yeah,
the Democrats are saying he's losing.
Well, I thought that my particular favorite part of it, and a part that I thought that you might have been as charmed by as I was when he was talking about how Trump had everyone leave the Oval Office except for him, which he said made him very uncomfortable because he thought something inappropriate might happen.
Right.
And the inappropriate thing that happened, that he thought of as inappropriate, was Trump telling him, I hope you can find your way to dropping the Michael Flynn investigation.
Right.
I hope that you drop this investigation. And the Republicans are now hanging their hat on the definition of the word hope. They're saying, oh, he hoped that this, he just said that he hoped it wasn't a directive.
Hope springs eternal.
But, you know, it reminds me of the Clinton, like, depends on what the definition of is.
I came from the town of hope.
And then even Donald Trump Jr. came out and said that, oh, when my father says something, you know whether he wants it or not. But Comey said in his testimony that, you know, he took that as a directive. He took that as the president meaning, you know, not just that he hopes, but that he was directing him to drop it. And my favorite part of the testimony, and I hope you appreciate this as a historian, is the example that Comey used when referring to his taking that as a directive was Henry II saying,
"Oh, I didn't. I missed that.
Will nobody rid me of this meddlesome priest?"
Yeah, that's
which led to the
that's a famous story.
Right, and then Angus King came back and quoted the date. He said 1170, Henry II.
Yeah.
And obviously that led to the assassination in the church of...
well, they didn't call it assassination then, because assassination means a political murder.
Yeah. Well, I think that qualifies, but
well, in modern terms, but under Henry VIII...
I think it was by far the geekiest moment in U.S. politics, I think, since Henry Wallace was raising theocracy as a national issue. And I just thought it was charming myself that that Comey brought up that incident and that quote from history, you know, going back 900 years, and then that Angus King recognized it and gave the date. You know, it was just like a nerd off, and I loved it.
I heard some lady talk about this. Yeah, supposing I had a gun and went up to you and held it to your head. I hope you turned the money over.
Yeah,
I thought that was a good
it's
one.
like a mob shakedown. Like that's a nice little federal government you got there. It'd be a shame if something happened to it. You know, like it's pretty traditional shakedown strategy. But
Well, anyway, and my conclusion is that the investigation with Comey is going to continue probably, what, several weeks, maybe several months, who knows?
oh yeah, I think we've got a long way to go, and just today, as we speak right now, actually, as this is being recorded, Attorney General Jeff Sessions is
Yeah.
in open
Recruits
testimony
himself.
between the Senate Intelligence Committee. And I was watching that before I came here. I didn't see anything earth-shattering yet.
Nothing.
It was pretty tame as far as I could tell so far. So
All right.
we'll see what ends up coming out of that by the end of the day.
All right. Well, let's go to a second question on the foreign policy. Do you have any new information on the bipartisan Congressional Intelligence Committee's investigation of Trump's connection to Russia?
Well, what I thought was interesting was that Comey confirmed without a doubt that Russia had meddled in the U.S. elections.
Yeah,
He
good.
said very straightforward, Russia was trying to manipulate the elections. There's no doubt in my mind that this happened. The Russians were doing it. And since then, we've actually had what I consider even more disturbing reports in Vanity Fair and other places that not only were they manipulating media coverage and doing things such as the Guccifer 2.0, WikiLeaks coordinating that stuff, there were at least attempts to actually hack into the election systems themselves in 39 states.
I believe that.
So we don't know yet whether they were succeeded in any of those states, but they were actually attempting to manipulate vote totals electronically in the election.
That's new.
And that's huge. I mean, that is direct interference with vote
Yeah,
totals.
that's true.
And that
The only problem is both sides do it.
well,
That goes back to the Soviet Union.
well, in 2004, well, yeah, and
Lenin and Stalin
and that
used,
should be-
used to send in agents to the United States through the Communist Party, the Socialist Party, and even
Yeah.
some Democrats.
And that's
Well, frankly,
fair, and
for
we should acknowledge that the United States itself has had a history of meddling in
No
elections in other countries.
No question
so
about
we
that.
can't be fainting violets about this.
Every Latin American
They're
election,
guilty as well.
every Latin American election is
Oh yeah,
fixed.
yeah, of course. When they're not, when the CIA isn't carrying out direct political
Money,
assassinations,
money.
yeah. But nevertheless, that doesn't change the fact that if Russia
Okay.
did interfere with our elections, that's a huge deal. And if they actually
Well,
manipulated vote totals,
fine.
that's a huge threat. That's basically an act of war by a foreign nation. Against our
It's up to
election
the Congress under the Constitution to declare it
to
as a
declare
war.
it so.
Now-
It is my opinion, and that's good enough for me, that is an act of war, though.
But who's going to declare it? President Trump? You want
no,
Trump to
no,
declare-
he won't even acknowledge
All
that
right,
this
well,
is a thing.
If you
which
want to
is
go to
another
war,
thing.
who's going to declare the war?
Which is, I didn't say that I want to go to war. I'm saying that it is an act of war against
Whatever that
us.
might mean.
But that's another thing that I thought was
That's a
interesting
journalist
from
approach. It is an act of war.
Comey's. Well, it's just my opinion, and my
Okay, your
opinion is
opinion.
good enough for me.
Good, thank you.
But
I'm a
Comey,
historian. I'm a little more legalistic.
Comey also testified that Donald Trump had absolutely no curiosity about this meddling. He never asked him about the meddling. He never asked him
There's no doubt-
in what
there's
ways
no
this
doubt-
investigation
no doubt
was.
that
So I thought that was interesting that the president has no curiosity
No,
about a
of
foreign
course
power meddling
it's
in
not a
U.S.
question.
elections.
Everybody, well, I think everybody knows that Putin, the Putin administration, has invested money in the United States.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
And Trump is buying estates in Florida,
Yeah.
bought with Soviet money.
Yeah.
And the United States has had oil connections with the Soviet Union, and we had oil concessions in Siberia. And when the Soviet Union collapsed under Gorbachev, there were American oil magnates who had money invested in Soviet oil production.
Yeah.
And that gets back to Saudi Arabia and Tillerson. Tillerson has the
Exxon,
power
yeah.
of manipulating the oil prices. And that's why the Soviet Union is trying to manipulate in the American elections in order to weaken
Oh, absolutely.
Rex Tillerson.
Well, and Tillerson, I mean, right now, the Senate is considering what to do with Russian sanctions, and Tillerson is opposing those sanctions against Russia.
He doesn't want war.
Because,
he wants to worry about
well,
climate change
well,
and nuclear bomb.
he says that he wants diplomatic avenues to remain open, but it's hard for me to believe that it doesn't have to do with oil and profit making.
Definitely
You know.
with oil. No
With a man like Tillerson from Exxon, and his history with Russia,
and he knows the oil prices.
and Russia's interest in
And economic historians know.
yeah, their economic
Right. And the
interest in
Saudis
it.
know it.
And then of course we have that other huge looming question mark with regard to Donald Trump, because he promised to release his tax returns and he never did.
That's another problem.
And so we don't know. His son has said that the Trump is heavily invested in Russia.
That's right.
The Trump businesses, and
But
we
the
don't
Republicans will
know.
do nothing. The
We have no
Republicans-
idea what the president's financial
Okay.
ties are to Russia, and they appear to be deep from everything that we know circumstantially.
So far. But we need more statistics. We need more investigations.
We do. We need transparency. We need a full vetting of all of this.
Anyway, are there any Republicans in Congress who are moving toward the Democrats in a bipartisan way to support the Democratic Congress's allegations? Do you see any shaky Republicans?
No, not really. What I saw was a doubling down after the Comey testimony.
Yeah.
I saw a lot of Republicans who were basically playing defense for the administration during the Comey testimony. I saw Fox News and most congressional Republicans carrying water like good little toadies for the Trump administration after it. Intentionally misleading the public about what Comey did and did not say. Like, one of my favorite examples is that they claimed that Comey said that not one vote changed. They said, he said there's no evidence that any votes changed, as though Comey could testify to whether anybody changed their mind due to Russian propaganda.
Well, that's one of his propaganda. I actually believe
all that Comey said was that he didn't have evidence that the actual physical votes were changed or manipulated by the Russians. He didn't testify whether to anybody changed their mind because of fake propaganda spread by Russian Twitter bots.
He has an interest in covering up. Well, anyway, to continue, on the 24th of May, Trump visited Saudi Arabia, the European countries at Brussels, the NATO alliance, and politically shook the hands of all American allies on a personal basis. Trump also visited Israel and went to the famous memorial, Yad Vashem, and gave his traditional speech repeating, "Never again." Mm-hmm. That thing has been a theme for 20, 30 years.
Yeah.
So this supposedly has silenced the many Democratic Party charges that Trump is an anti-Semite. Well, that remains to be debated. I was never raised as an anti-Semite. I never heard the term until I went to college in 1948. My mother believed, as a reader of the Bible, that the Jews are the chosen people. And since 1948, when Truman recognized the state of Israel, many American Jews quickly make the charge of anti-Semitism without talking personally with their Christian neighbors. I think it would be unfortunate if the Democrats win votes from the Republicans in Congress based on mere prejudice against Russia. Jewry has had long-term problems with Tsarist Russia, Communist Russia, and now Putin's Russia. Diplomats in the American State Department must treat Trump in an objective way to maintain a peaceful balance of power. Trump has, like his predecessor, Barack Obama, a secret relationship to Benjamin Netanyahu's government in Tel Aviv. In fact, Benjamin Netanyahu, through his prestige, through his votes to Trump over Hillary Clinton in the November 8th, 2016 election. And it's a fact that's being covered up by the American mass media. Most Republicans and Democrats voters can't tell the difference between a multilateral alliance ratified by the Senate as a treaty. They can't tell the difference for a treaty with an executive agreement, which is made by the president with foreign powers on a day-to-day basis, especially during wartime. Between 1941 and 1945, Churchill, Stalin, and Roosevelt made thousands of executive agreements. They're all buried in the archives, but the most important ones, the two most important ones, were published as communiques following the conference at Tehran in November of 1943 and the conference at Yalta in February of 1945. In the United States, for most Republican Party leaders at that time, isolationism as a viable foreign policy died after Pearl Harbor, 1941, by a declaration of Michigan's Republican Senator Arthur Vandenberg. And there were no more isolationists in the Republican Party or in the Democratic Party for many, many years. So, question 3. Do you have any review question about how the big three won World War II, in which Churchill, Stalin, and Roosevelt all understood the balance of power?
Well, I think that those three individuals specifically did understand the balance of power, and they were all playing a very intricate three-way chess match with each other.
That's right. Secretly.
Yeah. Well, yeah, obviously you have the different lines of communication and what impression you want to give. You know, the others, heads of state and heads of government, and then the impression that you want to give your own population, and then the impression that you want to give the world.
They all had 3 propaganda agencies.
Yeah.
The Americans had OWI, the Office of War Information.
I think from what I've read, I think Churchill was very wary of Stalin.
That's true.
I think that Roosevelt. I think that he thought that he could. I don't know if manipulate's the right word, but I think that he thought that he could play Stalin to a degree.
That's true.
I'm not sure if that's true that he could, as much as he thought that he could.
Yeah, he was an optimist.
He thought that he could.
And he tried it.
And yeah.
And he made some successes.
Yeah, I think there was some success.
His success was the United Nations San Francisco Conference, in which they set up the United Nations.
Yeah.
And it was Roosevelt who convinced Churchill and Stalin that the United Nations should replace the defunct League of Nations. Because Stalin knew, and Roosevelt knew, that the big three, after Hitler died, were going to turn to some kind of a new rivalry.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
And let's have
Because
these-
that's how it always works.
Let's have these debates at the UN
Right,
and the nuclear threat. You're not going to use nuclear bombs and solve anything.
right.
Okay, well, so I think that's a very interesting problem. Anyway, the big three did not talk about the reality of China, and they publicly were fighting for democracy. But the three powers all defined democracy to suit themselves. Britain and America had long time been liberal democracies. Stalin, following Lenin, was a believing communist and a Marxist. And both Lenin and Stalin were clever propagandists and ideologues. Privately, Lenin told his followers and Russian communists, "Liberals are useful idiots." Stalin, when he conquered Eastern Europe in 1945, Poland, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, the three Baltic states, set up satellite puppet parties. These so-called parties were satellite governments imposed by the Soviet Army. The Communist Empire had a one-party system. Some naive Americans could not distinguish between the difference of free democratic parties, which follow a constitution, and Stalin's reality of totalitarianism. So we come to another question. Why did the United States launch a propaganda campaign against the Soviet Union called the Cold War, beginning in 1945 and expanding in 1947, which lasted officially until 1991?
Well, I think that the Cold War, I think part of it has to do with the inevitable tension that you just referenced, that when after World War II there were these two big powers, the United States and Russia, and there's inevitably going to be a tension between two such big powers. It happens in every case of civilization throughout history.
That's right.
You have these rivalries, and that's just human nature. It's how it works. I think the Cold War, why it was the Cold War and not a hot war, and why that all happened, has directly ties to the development of the atomic bomb and nuclear weaponry.
That's good.
And there was, so you had at the very beginning, it was just the United States who had this atomic bomb, and you had a very interesting situation because there was an idea about, okay, what do we have this power, what do we do with it right now? We're the only country with it. Obviously, inevitably, a country as powerful as Russia is going to they're going to want theirs too, because they see that as a threat by the United States. So it sparks an arms race right away. And you had people arguing on all sides of it right away. You had people arguing, well, maybe we should just strike Russia now with it, strike their nuclear capabilities right now.
That's General Patton.
Yeah, exactly.
I want to march to Moscow. I got the tanks. Let's
Exactly.
go now.
Yeah, there's those very hawkish military types that were pushing that type of thing. And then you had people like Oppenheimer and others who were much more philosophical about it.
And who was Oppenheimer?
And Oppenheimer was one of the scientists who was behind the development of the atomic bomb.
Los Alamos, New Mexico.
Yeah, in Los Alamos.
And he knew what it was.
And you had people changing their thoughts. Originally, you had people like Bertrand Russell, who thought that, oh, maybe we should strike Russia right away. Maybe this is how we need to protect Western democracy.
I don't know how long that lasted.
But he didn't last for very long, because within a couple years, once Russia had been developing their own bombs and things had progressed to the point where the hydrogen bomb was being developed, which is thousands of times magnitude greater than the atomic bomb, Bertrand Russell was teaming up with Einstein.
That's right.
To have their basically this peace conference where they said, oh, wait, we need to get rid of all of this for the sake of humanity because humanity will destroy itself with these weapons. So it was an evolution.
That's an interesting fact.
It was an evolution of this, and I think that just that fact, the development of those weapons, plus the inevitable, clash of powers that happens throughout civilization, it led both in the public mind and in the foreign policy sphere. It led to the Cold War and what it was,
Okay.
And obviously the Truman administration handled it one way, and the Eisenhower administration, by the time they got around and by the time these weapons were developed even that much more in those 10 years.
The long-term American diplomat was George F. Kennan.
Mm-hmm.
Because he said from the very beginning, the Cold War is a piece of propaganda.
Yeah.
It's simply a cover-up for anti-communism.
Yeah.
Now, he was an anti-communist also, but he had a more cautious approach. He joined with Churchill. We have to contain the Soviet Union behind the so-called Iron Curtain with conventional weapons.
Mm-hmm.
And over a long period of time, the Soviet Union will collapse from within. And containment worked.
Right.
But it took until 1991 to convince 100% of the American people that it worked.
Yeah. Absolutely. And meanwhile, you had more hawkish people pushing paranoia, like the domino theory.
Yeah, right.
That, which led us down the path of Vietnam, that, if one country falls to communism, it's gonna domino and cascade in all these other countries. And you still hear some liberals like Bill Maher even. He'll defend Bill Maher on HBO.
He's a comic.
But he'll defend domino theory to this day with Vietnam. And what's interesting, the thing that theory always ignores is that you had some prominent people, actively trying to push those dominoes over. Che Guevara would be a great example. He was literally traveling to Africa, traveling through South America, trying to ignite this communist revolution throughout the world. He couldn't do it, So that's where the domino theory falls apart to me,
Yeah, right.
Because you had people trying to push those dominoes over, and it never happened.
Yeah. Well, I think I want to go back a little earlier. More important than the domino debate, you have to go back to 1949. In 1949, America's major allies joined a multilateral treaty organization called NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, established in 1949. The original 12 members have been expanded over the years, and it's now 16. And in 1951, Greece and Turkey joined. And then Germany came in 1955. There was a lot of delay by France. France didn't want them in, but eventually American power overruled the French. And then finally, after Franco died, Spain came in 1986. So NATO has been expanded, and I am a great fan of NATO. I'm a great fan of containment, and I think that NATO was the military implementation of George F. Kennan's containment doctrine, along with Churchill's metaphor, the Iron Curtain. So Churchill and Kennan and NATO were all on the same side. Now, America's relationship with Israel is based on each president's personal bilateral ad hoc executive agreements with the State of Israel, concluded in secrecy. The CIA has connections with Israel's Mossad. Looking at all of the presidents, from Harry Truman to Barack Obama, there have been three possible critics of Israel's foreign policy. Number one was Jimmy Carter, who lasted for one term, 1976 to 1980. The The second was George Herbert Walker Bush in 1991 during the first Iraq War. And then we have, number three, the German Jew Henry Kissinger, who was the national security advisor who treated Israel in a balance of power relationship. Kissinger pitted Egypt's Anwar Sadat against Israel's government from 1972 to 1976. Kissinger put pressure on Israel to negotiate with the Palestinians to make concessions in occupied Palestine. In negotiating a truce after the Yom Kippur War of 1972, which is also known as the Fourth Arab-Israeli War, Kissinger applied military pressure on Israel to withdraw from the Sinai Peninsula. Kissinger wanted Israel to recognize the independence of the State of Israel. This diplomatic move broke the Arab United Front between Egypt and its allies, Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, and Iraq. This diplomatic strategy separated Egypt from the rest of the Arab bloc. And I might raise a question about the fourth possible critic. Barack Obama's relationship with Israel was somewhat strained, as it is now known since the November 8th election in 2016. Israel's President Benjamin Netanyahu preferred Trump over Hillary Clinton, and especially over Senator Bernie Sanders from Vermont. Suppose Congress does force Trump to sell his Russian properties in the United States and release his tax returns. Will a vice president, newly called president, will Vice President Pence be any better than Trump? Now, looking at Secretary of State Rex Tillerson, will he be in charge of the big oil companies? Will Vice President Trump, or the new President Trump as Pence, be worse than Trump if Pence becomes the president? Question mark. If Trump loses all credibility, Tillerson has the choice of escalating war against Russia or try and figure out a new balance of power in the Middle East. Now, Secretary of State John Kerry, in the last years of the Trump administration, was changing his line about a peace ceasefire with Syria, or escalating the war against ISIS, the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, on a weekly basis. Kerry became very critical of Israel, and the Obama administration came too close when he said Israel is a state at the crossroads. Either Israel is a democratic state, and if it's a democratic state, it cannot be a Jewish state. And if Israel is a Jewish state, it is no longer a democratic state. Now that's getting down to the brass tacks. My interpretation of what Kerry said in the United States is running out of money and cannot finance all of America's so-called lies. I, as an American citizen, think that the United States has a special relationship with the United Kingdom. And secondly, priority is NATO. I was very sympathetic to the State of Israel from 1948 to 1967. But after the Six-Day War in 1967, I followed Kissinger's balance of power diplomacy. I am citing a new source that came out March 30th, 2017, by a Jewish foreign policy expert called Henry Siegman, who bluntly advocates a two-state solution for Israel and the Palestinian conflict. This article appeared in the left-wing London Review of Books, and Siegman quoted Trump for a speech he made on the 20th of February, 2017. Trump was so ignorant that he said, in effect, Palestine must acknowledge Israel's right of existence. Siegman replies, the PLO has acknowledged Israel's existence 3 times. The first time was the famous Resolution 242 at the end of the Six-Day War. The second time at the Oslo Conference, Yasser Arafat, the PLO, gave up 22% of the Palestinian territory, and which they supposedly had in the 1947 UN trusteeship plan. Arafat gave up the 1947 line and agreed to the 1967 line. Shimon Peres, Israel's prime minister, would not give up a single inch of land for the Palestinians. Siegman quotes and asks Benjamin Netanyahu to make the next concession at the UN. Trump's UN representative is Nikki Haley. She implies that she would like to have a two-state solution. But Netanyahu, on the other hand, believes in the one-state solution. Israel is not going to recognize a Palestinian state as long as Netanyahu is in charge. Netanyahu backed Trump in the November 2016 election over Obama, who seems to be wishy-washy in Netanyahu's opinion. And Trump's ambassador to Israel is David Friedman, a hardline neoconservative and a fan of Netanyahu. Before getting his job as ambassador, David Friedman wrote for the New York Times and backed AIPAC, the American-Israeli Pact.
This is just maybe a good moment for a station break.
Good.
Yeah.
We're moving slowly, but effectively, educationally, hopefully.
Yeah, well, I hope so.
Okay, so do you want to tell us who we are?
Yeah, I'm David DeWitt. I'm with the Athens News, and I'm here with distinguished Professor Emeritus Robert Whaley of the Ohio University, Professor of History. And this is Athens Speakout, and we're discussing the Trump administration and the Israel
Question.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. Yeah.
The Israelis have lots of problems with both question and
So, what's to be done with Israel and Palestine? That's the question at hand.
Right. Well, anyway, Netanyahu and Friedman and Trump are in a stew. Now, Rex Tillerson might suggest in the next few months that America's relationship with Israel is a bigger problem than the so-called Russian threat. The United States, because of the nuclear arms race, has a vital interest in continuing to work on a regional disarmament problems. And then there is the further American-Russian agreements about how to handle Islamic terrorists in the greater Middle East. Question for Dave. Do you have any questions or criticisms about the confusion in Trump's foreign policy about where he wants to put America's armed forces? Syria, Iraq, Israel, Saudi Arabia, Egypt?
I don't know what he's going to do militarily.
And neither do I.
I thought it was interesting that he took that as president. Usually presidents, their first stop is somewhere like Canada or like on a foreign trip, Canada or the UK. he chose Saudi Arabia for his first foreign visit, which is
That's
unusual.
That's the oil.
Yeah.
It's not unusual.
And then he
but
made
I
and then he
understand.
made $100 billion arms deal with them as well.
Yeah.
I mean, he's postured aggressively toward North Korea.
Well, that's a minor issue.
He's done airstrikes. He launched the Tomahawk missiles in Syria, and he's continued
That's a problem.
to do airstrikes in Syria.
That's a real
And he
problem.
talks tough about Syria, but he hasn't indicated so far that he's interested in putting any ground troops there.
That's true. He wants Egypt and Turkey and Saudi Arabia to do it for him. But Egypt,
Yeah.
Saudi Arabia, and Turkey, and Iran, the fourth power,
Right.
are all hostile to one another.
Yeah, exactly. And that's why I don't know if it was such a great. I mean, it seems to me like if with the arms deal with the Saudi Arabia, he's kind of taking the Sunni side of the Sunni
Yeah,
Shiite
that's right.
question, which I think is a mistake to get involved in any way in that. That debate's been raging amongst them since what, 700, since
That's
Muhammad
right.
died
That
in
is true.
700 AD. So
No, people don't change their religion.
yeah, it's
Except
just
in the United States.
it's not very good long-term thinking to invest in that
Right.
squabble in any way.
Right.
I don't know what he's going to do military. He campaigned on a kind of more reserve, like more isolationist, not isolationist, but less interventionalist, I guess I should say. But whatever he campaigned, I mean, you can't take him at his word for anything because he lies like he breathes. You know, he'd lie about you about the time of the day just for the practice. So it's hard to tell what he's going to do military. Do you have any idea what he might do?
No, none whatsoever. But I will know these facts, that Turkey, Saudi Arabia, and Egypt, and Iran, from the Zionist state, they don't like any of these neighbors. And they are dependent on the United States technology for advanced weapons. And the United States has given the most advanced fighter, the F-35, only to Israel. So Russia has a dictator, Vladimir Putin, and he would like to form a U.S.-American agreement to repress the Arab-Muslim jihadists on a regional basis. If Donald Trump might know what he's talking about with American First, and that would cause a hostility in the Democratic Party, particularly among Jewish Americans. It is a new time to review the history of the first 5 Arab-Israeli wars beginning in 1947. The first war is called the War of Independence, 1947 to 1949, by the Israelis. A divided Palestine was originated by Great Britain's Foreign Minister, Lord Balfour, in the famous Declaration of November 1917, which promised, quote, a homeland for the Jews. On the other hand, Colonel T.E. Lawrence, stationed with General Allenby's army in Cairo at the end of World War I, organized Arab families to become new kings in the mandates of Iraq, Jordan, and Palestine. So the British Army still controlled the armed forces of their League of Nations mandates from 1919 to 1939. The idea of a mandate was that after about 10 or 20 years, there would be an independent Arab state in Iraq and Jordan. The Palestinian problem then, from 1917 to 1939, created unanticipated problems for the British Empire. On the eve of the First World War, private Jewish refugees from Poland migrated to Palestine with the new Zionist ideology. Jewish immigrants claimed that there should be a Jewish Zionist state established within the next 20 or 30 years. With the British possessions of Palestine in 1917, the theoretical possibility of a Zionist state became a new hope for the Zionist movement. From 1917 to 1939, more and more individual Jews from Russia, Poland, Hungary, and other dislocated East European countries settled in Palestine. They bought up land as private individuals from poor indigenous Palestinian neighbors. The rich Jewish immigrants even established a Hebrew university in Jerusalem for the Jewish settlers as early as July 1918. By 1937, the indigenous Palestinian terrorists began to bomb and demand that the British High Commissioner in Jerusalem cut off any further European refugees coming to Europe. The British Chamberlain government set up a Peel Commission which suggested to the British High Commissioner to establish two independent states to satisfy both communities. Neville Chamberlain was faced with the prospect of war with Hitler over Poland. On the 23rd of May, 1939, the British government in London approved the Peel Commission's plan, which limited any further immigrants to 75,000 Europeans. On the 18th of May, 1939, the Jewish Labor Party in Jerusalem called a general strike. Hitler's repression of Jews from 1933 to September 1939 was increasing the flow of Jewish immigrants to Palestine. London issued a ban to any further Jewish immigrants from Europe on the eve of the Second World War. From 1939 to 45, British and American Jews enthusiastically joined the British military, and some were planning to become Zionists to move to Israel as soon as the war ended. July 1946, Irgun terrorists, wanting to get the British out of the Mandate, bombed the King David Hotel, killing 19 innocent people. Ernest Bevin was British foreign minister and wanted to negotiate a peaceful plan to turn over the Mandate to the Americans, since the British Empire was bankrupt and dependent on America for further loans since 1946. In January of 1947, there was a long, debatable Anglo-American conference with American, British, Jewish, and Arab representatives. The Arabs and the Jews were each wanting total loggerheads because both parties were demanding an independent one state. President Harry S. Truman became embroiled with Bevin stalling, and Truman demanded that the British admit 100,000 refugees from Europe on an emergency basis. In frustration, it was Ernest Bevin who suggested that he would unilaterally turn the mandate over to the United Nations Trusteeship Council. The new Prime Minister, a Labour Prime Minister, Clement Attlee, simply announced publicly in February of 1947 that the mandate had ended and the United Nations Trusteeship Council would draw up a petition plan. I, Robert Whaley, think we should continue discussing the British foreign policy from earlier times to the balance of power shift as a result of Truman's recognition of Israel in 1948. In May of 1939, the British Labour Party, no, the Jewish Labour, in May of 1939, on the eve of the war, the Jewish Labour Party in Jerusalem called for a general strike. Hitler's repression of the Jews from 1933 to September 3rd was increasing the flow of Jewish immigrants to Palestine. London issued the bar of any further Jewish immigrations from Europe on the eve of the Second World War. So from 1939 to 45, the American and British Jews enthusiastically joined the British military, and some were planning to become Zionists to move to Israel as soon as the war ended. So in July of 46, the Irgun terrorists, wanting to get rid of the British and the Mandate, bombed the King David Hotel, killing 19 innocent people. Ernest Bevins wanted to negotiate a peaceful plan to turn the Mandate over to the Americans, since the British Empire was bankrupt. So in January of 47, there was a long, debatable Anglo-American conference with American, British, and Jewish and Arab representatives. And the Arabs and the Jews each went into loggerheads. And in frustration, Bevan turned the administration over to the United Nations unilaterally. And Clement Attlee announced in February of 47 that the Mandate had ended and the United Nations stressor would draw up the partition plan. When the British Empire was number one from let's go back way in time. When the British Empire was number one from 1763 to 1914, the Foreign Office, the War Office, and the Colonial Office, and the Commonwealth Office seldom boasted about being number one. The term Great Britain was only proclaimed in 1801 during the Napoleonic Wars. British formally proclaimed itself an empire in 1877 when the British Prime Minister Benjamin Disraeli proclaimed Queen Victoria the Empress of India. This decree was only possible after the Indian Mutiny, the Sepoy Mutiny, after 1857-59, involving a complex military relationship between the protected princely states, both Hindu and Muslim parties. The British picked up colonies on an ad hoc basis between 1497 and 1956. The British added various other spheres of influence and protectorates in World War II in the Middle East. In reality, the British Empire peaked in 1956 at the end of the Suez Crisis, also known as the Second Arab-Israeli War. Even after 1956, some hardline reactionary Tories, such as Prime Minister Thatcher, who was elected in 1979, still thought she ruled over an empire. Her military intervention in the Falkland Islands in April of 1982 lasted for 74 days, and the war cost 649 Argentine military troops, and the British naval personnel lost 255 lives. The British had claimed the islands since 1833 as a crown colony in 1841. The Argentines claimed that the Falkland Islands were the Malvinas Islands, picked up from the Spanish colonial claim before Argentina was even an independent country. It took the British economists a long time to calculate that the military cost to save 1,500 Scots sheepherders wasn't quite worth it. Simon Wren Lewis, professor of politics at Oxford, wrote an article on a blog called Mainly Macro, April 2012. The total cost of this war was £2 billion, and it was the last gasp of a declining empire. Margaret Thatcher, as Prime Minister, set a tone for the election of another ultra-conservative, or reactionary Ronald Reagan in 1980. The so-called Long War, beginning in 1945, which ended officially in 1991, was 180 degrees hostile to the policy of isolationism. As a
2 minutes.
2 minutes?
We have 2 minutes.
Well, I suppose we can stop here with isolationism and NATO and oil problems because we've got too many cards on the table now. And you can give your summary of my long-winded explanation of American, Anglo-American and Israeli relationships.
Well, I think that for such a complex and complicated subject, you did a good job. In the short amount of time here, we have explaining some of the history behind it, and hopefully next time we can get into some of the major policy problems that we and the history. Yeah, there's a lot more history to go here.
Yeah,
So.
well, we've got to go back to these wars. The first war, the second war,
Right.
and particularly the third war.
Which is where
The problem gets deeper.
everything started to begin with.
Not
so,
started, but
Yeah.
intensifies.
Yeah, in the third war. Yeah.
And the Israeli problem intensifies with the third Six-Day War.
Yeah. in
Okay, well,
67.
thanks for coming.
Well, thank you very much,
We
Professor.
got a future discussion about democracy. We have to keep debating. Debate is the oxygen of democracy. Thanks for
That's right.
sustaining this long dialogue.
Thank you so much.